Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the free webinar, The War, Trauma, Moral Injury, and the Search for Meaning. This webinar is brought to you by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Leadership Institute, Supervised Ministry, and the Public Theology Department. I'm your host today, Dr. Chris Burton, the director of the Leadership Institute, and I want to go through the wonderful panel that we have gathered for you today. For all of you who are watching all over the world, thank you so much for being here with us. One of my colleagues here is Dr. Rachel S. Bard. She is our Director of Public Theology and a Professor of Theology here at Union Presbyterian Seminary. We're also joined by Dr. Joshua Morris, who is our Professor of Pastoral Care here at Union Presbyterian Seminary's Charlotte campus. We're also joined by Dr. Dorothy Tripodi, who is our Director of Supervised Ministry here at Union Presbyterian Seminary on the Richmond campus. And of course, we're joined by two of our esteemed colleagues, not a part of the Union community, but they've come to feel very much like family as we've been working not only on this, but on other collaborative efforts. First, we want to introduce to you all Dr. Roman Solovey. Dr. Roman Solovey is the chairman of the Eastern European Institute of Theology in Lviv, Ukraine, and also the Langham Literature Regional Commissioning Editor for Eastern and Central Europe and Central Asia. And lastly, Dr. Wojciech Scherba, who is the provost of the Evangelical School of Theology in Wrocław. Welcome to you all so much. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Dr. Morris, I want to start with you. We know that soldiers engaged in active war do so based on core values. These values such as defending freedom and well-being of a nation. When we think about what happens in war, where there's so many opportunities for violations of morality or moral injury that occurs due to violence and acts of war, we know that this can impact one's ability to function. So how do we, specifically as religious communities, address the needs of these soldiers and their families?
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Leadership Institute, for bringing us all together today, and for my esteemed colleagues who I'm looking forward to learning from. But I think it's important for me to sort of start why this is important to me as a way to kind of get into the religious question. I'm as a veteran myself, and coming to terms with homecoming, of what it means to come back from war, what it means to try to come back into like a normal civilian life, whatever that means. But then also as a caregiver, as a chaplain, what does it mean to, provide care to veterans and service members and their families? And even in that first word, homecoming, I think is a privilege I'm trying to name that I know for others on the screen, the idea of home or homecoming is the very thing that's being invaded. It's the very thing that is causing the trauma, the displacement of civilians, the displacement in fighting on your own country. So I want to make sure that I name my own privilege of I got to come home. So how do we get here? You talk about the morality of war and those issues that are going on. And so this idea of moral injury, I think, is an important framework to think about, where this, sort of emerges. And it's still somewhat new. I mean, the early 1990s is the first time we really hear this concept, moral injury. It's in a VA context here in the United States where, Jonathan Shea was talking about what happens in those combat moments when what's right has been betrayed. So there's this threefold idea that there's been a betrayal of what is morally right by someone who holds legitimate authority. So that could be a leader, and that could be an elected official, someone who's a leader, and then in a high stakes situation. So of course you can see how in combat and in war that these things are ripe for these opportunities. And then that sort of stays the way we understand moral injury for almost a generation. That it's once the early veterans of the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, when they start to come home in the late aughts, early teens, and they start to talk about moral injury of, well, what if we're the one who's perpetrated the act? What if we're the ones who have betrayed our values? That it wasn't just that it's done to us, but we're the ones who are doing the betraying, who are doing the perpetrating, who are failing to prevent these atrocities. And so your second part of the question of religious communities, I think, is helpful because these early definitions were from psychology or psychologists, psychiatrists who were working with veterans in like a clinical context. And I think theology and my fellow panelists have a lot to say about this, about what it means for religious communities to stand in solidarity with veterans and service members who are dealing with this stuff. And so the thing I'm interested in, and then I'll stop talking, is religious communities that can nurture, that can empower, and that can liberate, that are spaces that can hear these stories, hear the stories of war, and what it means for these veterans to come home who perhaps like need to talk about this stuff in a way, but they don't know who to talk about it with. But like, may we be those communities that can hold the space, to be able to hear that. And so with that, I'll kick it back to you, Chris.
Oh, certainly. And I would love to bring Dr. Skarba into this conversation, especially thinking about you being awarded the Silver, preserving the identity of ethnic and cultural minorities in Poland. Thinking about, tying into what Dr. Morris shared, but also wondering about the impact of the war that you've seen at the border and how that's really affected the acceptance of different people groups within Poland, including the Ukrainian refugee groups. If you could share with us a bit about your experience in this regard.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. I think my experience or my insight may be a little bit different. And let me refer to the beginning of the war in Ukraine. I remember when I came from the States, and at the time, and the war started in Poland, I was really amazed to see so many hundreds and thousands of people just squatting in Polish cities, on Polish borders. Many of them didn't know exactly what to do. They didn't have nothing with them. They were mainly women, children, seniors, and it was really touching and very difficult experience for many of us in Poland. And nobody knew exactly in which direction it would go. But I think what happened was that suddenly just private people, they woke up. They went to, they jumped to their cars and they drove to eastern borders or to trains, and they just took those people who were there, homeless and lost, to their houses. And this was probably one of the most surprising thing I have ever seen in my life, some kind of civil society type of attitude. So, and the result was that there has never been refugee camps in Poland for Ukrainian refugees or anything like that. But what was really, so this was wonderful, really. And I think this civil movement from, let's say, underneath somehow, it forced our government to follow it up and to introduce some legal acts which help them really to integrate those people into our society. Because previously, our government, together with other governments from the Visegrad group, they had this idea of this rule of no refugees on Polish land. And suddenly there were hundreds and thousands, millions of them actually. So far, I think Polish border has been crossed more than 10 million times from the Ukrainian side. And naturally, not all of those, some of the people went back, some of them went to Germany and other countries. But right. I think it was again important that it was just society that somehow forced the government to do something, to follow it up and to integrate those people into society. However, what happened was, so this was one surprise. The other surprise was that the church as an institution didn't play any role in that. Even now, 2 years after that, I mean, we have never heard anything from this, from the leaders of major churches in our country, that the church somehow opened their doors for the refugees. And this was it was really a huge surprise and discouragement for many people in our country. Naturally, there are lots of communities, faith communities that are participating in it. Lots of pastors, lots of people who are believers. However, the church as an institution has been silent. And we thought, well, this would be a wonderful idea to open their churches, their buildings, to share the resources they have, but they have never done it. So I'm wondering. When I'm thinking of all these moral injuries and this really difficult situations and hard really to define, I'm thinking on the one hand, the religious communities may help in coping with the situation. On the other hand, they may harm, and they may make this situation even harder. So on the one, I'm thinking of Polish institutional churches, but on the other hand, I'm also thinking, let's say, of the language that is used by, let's say, Russian Orthodox Church, or used to be used in this context. And again, I'm thinking the religious communities can be helpful. On the other hand, not necessarily in our European context.
No, that's really fascinating when you think about the ways in which, at least is how I'm hearing you describe it, Dr. Scarba. It's almost as if sometimes religious communities can actually serve as not only passive participants in the situation, but actually be doing more harm than good. And that does sound pretty unfortunate. But I want to open up that particular question to the rest of the group, really thinking about in general when we talk about the human condition and how fraught it can be with suffering. You know, whether it's the horrendous suffering historically we saw it at Auschwitz, where we're seeing around the world in global conflicts, the atrocities of apartheid, war trauma that gets passed on through generations. There seems to be this sort of play between the suffering that has been experienced and also this continuous search for hope and this continuous search for a reason to be, or even a way to change that human condition of violence and suffering. So I want to open this up to you all. Where do we find strength and hope? Let's start with that first question. Where do we find in the midst of these catastrophes? Where can we find strength and hope? I want to open that up to the group.
I might comment about this a little bit. You know, I do not pretend to give any generalized answers to this question, because each situation and each trauma is unique, and it requires a specific approach. But I would like to speak about our experiences in Ukraine, and there are several aspects that I would like to address in this issue. So first of all, I would like to mention that Ukrainian experience is that we have a total and encompassing nature of the trauma that we experienced and we are still experiencing. It is not just one event or some separate occasion or some disaster. You know, just overnight, our entire lives were threatened, and for many and for most of us, destroyed, just over one night. So just to give you some information, more than 30% of Ukrainians were forced to flee their homes and became displaced persons or refugees. 40% of Ukrainian children do not live in their homes. So every second Ukrainian child left their homes. They are or displaced persons or refugees. Millions of people found themselves under occupation, or their families are under occupation, facing horrible regime there. Many towns and villages have been destroyed, and tens and possibly hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. So almost every family is now divided. My family is divided because two of my children officially are refugees in European countries. And the second aspect, the trauma of Ukrainians combine individual and collective dimensions. So on the one hand, each of us is going through our own path, overcoming our own challenges, experiencing fear, uncertainty, and despair. And Wojciech knows much about that because he was in contact with me since the first hours of the war. But on the other hand, this individual trauma is amplified, multiplied by the tragedy of the entire destroyed country and nation. So it's like a waves. Every day we learn about news about our friends and relatives who are dying at the front line, getting wounded or maimed. Just to give you one number, since the beginning of the war, more than 3,000 of Ukrainians have lost their limbs. It's just a total national tragedy. Almost every family has someone in the army or has already been killed in the war. So we have all been deeply traumatized by the stories of Russian troops, crimes against humanity, tortures and murder of civilians and mass rape. I've been to the liberated territories north to Kiev just a few weeks after they were liberated, and it was impossible just to listen to the stories of the people who survived, and they were describing the atrocities, the horrible situations they were witnessing to or experiencing. So what I would like to say is that even if an individual person has not been personally affected by the war, as part of the nation and society, he or she is still experiencing trauma. And third important aspect that I always mention when I talk about war is that this war has an existential nature. So it is not the war about territory or for political influence or economical resources. It is the war for survival. So if Russia were to win, we would end up in concentration camps or at best become refugees. So this is sad prospect that still faces each of us. And now, where can we find some hope in such circumstances? So from my experiences as pastor and theologian, I find it in several ways. Firstly, in serving others who have been further damaged by the war, even more than we. In particular, just to give you one example, our church, it's a local evangelical community in Lviv, Western Ukraine, have been serving displaced people for almost 2 years now, providing them with food, clothing, hygiene items, and especially for spiritual, moral, and psychological assistance. And just to explain you that in these acts of love and solidarity, very practical acts, I am personally renewed in my faith in humanity, in the fact that the world has not completely gone mad, that it is possible to return to peaceful life, however distant this prospect may be now. And the second important factor of support for me was my family and community of friends, both in country and outside of country, and especially those who were with me in country, inside Ukraine, with whom we have been involved in the refugee evacuations and other humanitarian projects since the beginning of the war. So we have been together for 2 years now, and those people, they have been a source of support and encouragement for me all the time. Those people, I always joke, that those are the people that never ask me how I am. Because this is the worst question you can ask people who are in the situation like we Ukrainians are. You can, I have friends in the United States. They're good people. I love them. They're good Christians. But I don't know how to respond to the question, how am I? Just to give you official answer, well, I'm alive, I'm okay, I'm serving God, that's one thing. But to tell what I'm actually experiencing, it's almost impossible to share. Only those people who are going with me through this nightmare and hell, they would understand it without words. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. Anyone else care to share on this whole notion of where do we find strength and hope? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to refer to what Roman said, and just would like to say I'm not sure if there are universal general answers. Really, I mean, as a Christian, I would like to say, well, we find hope in God or in Jesus. But then as a human being, I'm asking myself, what does it mean? Really, what does it mean? And it's just honestly, there are moments where I just say, I don't know. And with a question asked, there is this reference to Viktor Frankl and to other people who were trying to find hope in impossible situations. And they found their hopes in different ways and different spheres. And sometimes they didn't find hope, but still survived. So I don't know. For Frankl, it was logotherapy, or just looking for the sense. Levinas would say that he saw God in another prisoner, but Elie Wiesel would say that God died on the gallows of Auschwitz.
Right.
There were some people who found faith and hope in Christ. understood in certain ways, and some, well, who are somehow lost. And I'm always surprised. I just reading about those who survived Auschwitz. How many of those committed suicide afterwards? It was somehow impossible for them to cope with the situation of the, let's say, free world. So I don't know. The situation seems to be impossible, and we're trying to do our best. I'm thinking of my friend Roman, and I'm really glad that he is finding the hope. And I would agree that, well, just maybe serving others, maybe this kind of Bonhoeffer type of Christianity that we are, even though we cannot, we're not trying to explain this world with God. We realize that it might be somehow abandoned, but still we're just trying to follow Christ and see in another person Christ, or be some kind of Christ to another person. Maybe it somehow works out. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as I'm hearing you say this, it's making me think a lot about at least a problem that I know we have in the West, and particularly in the United States, is our sort of rush to find an answer for something. You know, so even going back to the question that Dr. Solovey was saying of people knowing better than to ask, "How are you?" Right? Like in the midst of something so difficult. It makes me think about our need to have the answer, the sort of prolific nature of virtue signaling, and making sure that you're like saying the right thing and performing in the right way. You have, you change your Instagram or your Facebook profile. You're making sure you're commenting on things in a sort of correct way to sort of show you're on the right side of whatever the conflict is. But I wonder, and I want to share this with you all to respond. How much of the sitting in Shiva of the Jewish tradition should we be adopting? And instead of trying to find the best words, just having a sort of presence that's mournful. I'm almost thinking about, I often joke that the only thing that Job's friends got right with the first thing was when they saw the catastrophe he had gone through, they just were quiet. So how much of that should we be adopting in the face of, so many catastrophes happening simultaneously?
I'm reminded of Paul Tillich, who was a chaplain in the First World War and wrote to his father from the battlefields of Verdun, "Hell rages around us." And he was burying fellow soldiers morning, noon, and night, basically, and he himself suffered psychologically very deeply from this. But the thing that he identified was that he would agree with Wiesel that God died. For him, God didn't wait until Auschwitz to die, but died in the trenches of World War I. And what he meant by that is this God of optimism. And I think sometimes when we talk about hope, we think in terms of optimism, maybe especially in the United States, which is a very optimistic country. And Tillich would say we need to talk about meaning. And Viktor Frankl, of course, said that as well in his own writing. And the question then of not so much where do you find hope, but how do we create meaning despite? So not hope because of something, but meaning despite something. And this is not easy. And again, no universal answers necessarily, because people will find meaning in different ways and sometimes maybe even be led astray with that. But I think that is at least one potential starting point.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you.
In addition to what was already shared, when you asked that question originally, Chris, my first response was, do we not need to observe in some way, shape, or form Shiva? In the sense that we stand silently, but with respect and in solidarity concerning that incredible suffering and terror and trauma that Dr. Solovey described. But at the same time, I'm reminded of Bonhoeffer, who says, if you don't speak, who will speak on behalf? And so then the question is, how do we move out of this recognition of the horror that's going on, of the human atrocities and the suffering on so many multiple levels, from individual to family to nation and to global impact? how do we then step into these spaces? And I was reminded of the Talmud when it says, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And so then the question is, how do we respectfully, vulnerably, without false hope or enthusiasm, enter into the space so it can become potentially some sort of sacred space, recognizing that that sacredness comes out of suffering.
Yeah. Thank you, Dorothy. I would like just to briefly comment. Actually, Wojciech already raised this issue about the role of churches and religious organizations that are often quiet. My experience during those 2 years, that was constant struggle with international evangelical institutions. I wouldn't give any specific names, but almost all of them, they were very hesitant in taking stands, in taking position. It took so much energy and discussions and fighting actually to make some appeal publicly condemning the war and identifying with victims. So when you talk about this sacred place, it's first of all a respect to victims of the war. And unfortunately, for so many churches, that was difficult. And one of the forms of violence to the victims of the war, and maybe I'm talking a bit ahead of our next issues, is a forced reconciliation. So even last year, when the war just started here in Europe, there was forums under European Evangelical Alliance for the victims of displacement, for those who are displaced persons and refugees. And the leaders of this event, they wanted to put together in one platform Ukrainian representative, Russian representatives, that make them pray together, to shake hands, and to pretend like everything is normal. And this happening everywhere. This happening in literature. So Ukrainian writers that come abroad, they're often forced to speak together with Russian writers at one scene, at one platform, Ukrainian actors and Ukrainian theologians. And for me, this is something which is lacking respect and this sacred attitude towards the victims of the war, that they are forced to pretend like everything is normal. I know the world wants to go back to normality. I know that Ukrainian war and now maybe what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and other places, it's like makes other people feel uncomfortable. We all want to live in a normal world where everything is predictable and you can calculate everything and you know what to expect to. And those horrible situations, they makes us feel uncomfortable. And that's why we want to put those people together, make them hug each other, shake hands, and then pretend that everything is normal. So I think that religious organizations and churches sometimes could be not only a source of healing of the trauma, but also the source of trauma, maybe unconsciously. But I've seen this so many times during those 2 years of the war.
Yeah, and Dr. Solovey, I think you're setting my brain alight, because there's so many nuggets of wisdom in what you're describing, and I think that you're really helping us all understand the ways in which some of the calls for peace are really a call for a false peace. It's not actually about really solving a situation. It's almost just to say, like, just stop making all that noise. And it just makes me think about the great Peter Tosh, who spoke about everyone's crying out for peace, but none are crying out for justice. This whole understanding of people wanting a really weak and limited imagination understanding of peace, but not the sort of peace that's actually restorative and healing for all parties involved. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
To that same notion, I want to invite Dr. Bard in to help us understand this. Is building on what Dr. Solovey said, is true reconciliation even possible? What would a philosophical or theological or theological response look like now in terms of repair and reparations in light of all that's been done?
Before I answer, I think Dr. Cherba wanted to say something.
Oh yeah, please jump in
response. Did you want to say something, Dr. Cherba? You were
Sorry.
before I start.
Oh, good.
First of all, I wanted to ask a kind of controversial question. Can
Yes.
we talk in this context about different types of suffering? You know,
Yes. Yes.
when we
Yes.
talk about suffering in an individual sense, is a different thing. In terms of community, it might be a different sense. In terms of a nation or globally as a species or some, it's different. And then we have different categories in which we can understand or don't understand from different perspectives, and resolutions also can be somehow applied differently or something like that. And also, I think that, well, that this question asked from different perspectives, they sound differently. For instance, this question about suffering from the perspective of the first world is a different. It sounds different to me as a question asked by from a developing country, and somebody who's observing the suffering of others, and somebody who is experiencing the suffering.
Right.
So this was something that I learned, I think, thanks to Roman in the beginning of the war, that I was one of those who wanted to ask, hey, how are you doing? And how can I help you? And then I realized that these are the worst questions I can ask, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I can, I try not to ask this kind of questions. On the other hand, I'm trying not to be passive, just totally silent in Shiva. So somehow we are trying to speak out in a kind of Bonhoeffer way, but maybe through actions.
Yeah.
So what I would say, for instance, to my friends like Roman or something, I would say, hey, no answers, nothing like it. Just come and spend some time with us. Let's be together, and we don't pretend to understand anything more than you, or we don't pretend that we can feel what you feel, but we can spend some time together, and we can share the same bread. And I don't know, maybe in this context, this is the maximum that we can get.
That reminds me of the emphasis in a lot of, especially more recent forms of liberation theology, on accompaniment. Right, which it really is, and it's more than spending time together. It can take the form of actually doing things for people. I was reading the life story of Dr. Paul Farmer, who started an organization that delivered healthcare for the poor, with my students earlier this week. And accompaniment in his context, in serving the poor in Haiti, consisted of, if a guy needed a battery for his flashlight, you would provide the battery. Just those small kind of being human together things that is part of that accompaniment, without lofty promises of everything will be okay, or the how are yous, or anything of that sort. And you also talked about suffering, and I want to use that to go back to the question that Chris asked about reconciliation. In many classes over the years, I would encounter students who have had experiences of sexual abuse. And one of the first things that they would say in response to that trauma is, don't ask me to forgive the perpetrator. So much more is that the case when it comes to situations of war, or in my own context of origin of South Africa with, centuries of colonialism and then 46 years of apartheid. But I also want to flip the question. I don't think asking for quick resolutions, for quick reconciliation in the form of, as again, since we're talking about Bonhoeffer today, in the form of cheap grace, as he would have called it.
Yes.
That's definitely not very helpful. But I want to flip the question, which is, what is the alternative to reconciliation? And there are basically two alternatives to reconciliation, and the one is apartheid and the other one is war. And so taking lessons from my own context, which didn't quite have the kind of war in my lifetime that you're currently experiencing, but apartheid was rooted in the trauma of war. Centuries of different wars, but also in particular the second or the Anglo-Boer War. But it started even before that with people giving up on reconciliation. This idea that we're too different, we cannot get along, there's already been too much conflict, let's just all separate. Let's just all live in our own kind of separate bubbles. And so I think one of the important lessons to learn from South Africa is reconciliation is not just something that we need to think about in the aftermath of some national trauma, but we need to ask ourselves to what extent that national trauma is the result of a lack of reconciliation. Now, this does not directly apply to situations such as that of Ukraine, of course not. But it does suggest that reconciliation is a very strong moral imperative. But it's definitely not easy. It's not easy. It's not a matter of sitting around the table and suddenly we're all just going to get along and pretend that everything is fine, because it isn't. So that's one of the lessons I take from my own context when it comes to reconciliation. Reconciliation in the South African context was also largely, at least in the aftermath of apartheid, was largely premised upon the African philosophical concept of Ubuntu, which I think holds a lot of value also for other cultural contexts. Because what it does is it recognizes our common humanity. But more than that, it recognizes that when we are in conflict with one another, we all lose a part of our humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can help people see that, find that common humanity, that's at least the foundation for building reconciliation. It's not going to be the end all. Reconciliation is hard work. South Africa's been busy with it now for decades. It's definitely not always happening on the ground, quite the contrary. But it is a constant daily choice. And I want to conclude with one more thing from my favorite theologian, Paul Tillich, who says that we are, as human beings, the human condition consists of being torn in a way between where we come from and where we're going. And this is basically his take on the old being versus becoming dichotomy in philosophy. Or in theology, it correlates with with the sacramental, the presence of the divine, the presence of meaning within where our existence, versus the prophetic, the calling out from that existence. And so I think, and he talks about the where we're coming from in terms of things like nation state, the blood and soil stuff, right? The powers of origin. So much of our conflicts originate there. Not all of it, but a lot of our conflict originates in things such as national identity, land ownership, etc., etc., etc. We are at the same time prophetically called toward the future. And one of the things I think that makes it possible to start building reconciliation is if we can say, even though we hate one another, because we are fighting about where we're from, we are fighting in the name of our ancestors in a certain sense. But we need to go to tomorrow. We need to, instead of waging war in the name of our ancestors at the expense of our children, we need to orient ourselves towards the future. Now, this is, of course, all easier said than done. But they're just building blocks for starting to create some theological framework where we can say, despite all of this, are there ways for us to start recognizing, lamenting, building justice, speaking truth? Remember, it was in South Africa, truth and reconciliation, not quick and easy reconciliation. Speaking the truth, doing the work of lament, and then doing the hard work based on our common humanity and with that orientation towards the future. So a mouthful, lots of loose ideas to clobber together there.
But wonderful things to ponder.
Yeah, in Ukraine we distinguish clearly between two kinds of reconciliation, internal and external with Russia. Internally we have a lot of divisions, and they are growing. Like one of the largest, the most bitter divisions between those who are in the army and those who are not in the army. Mm-hmm. And my friends and colleagues and church members, 10 of our church members from my community are in the military, in the army now. They are getting bitter now because they spent for 2 years on the cutting edge of life and death, and they're not happy with those who stay in a peaceful life. And there are many, many more other divisions, and we are looking for reconciliation. And me and some of my colleagues, we are working toward this. We are doing seminars, we are working with chaplains, with vets, with other people. But the question of reconciliation with Russians at this stage of the war seems to me to be simply untimely. Let me just explain it briefly. We just do not know who among us will live to see the time when condition for at least talking about reconciliation will arise. So we cannot make decision today for those who will be responsible for this difficult task. We do not know how many people will die and what other crimes Russians will commit. We do not know what we will have behind us when we will come to the point where there is a prospect of talking about reconciliation. But from a biblical perspective and referring to Miroslav Volf, exclusion and embrace, there is hope that one day we will be able to reconcile. However, this hope is only possible if, first of all, Russians are willing to put in the hard work first. So they must acknowledge and condemn the criminal nature of this aggression, ask for forgiveness for the crimes against Ukrainians, and take steps to compensate for the damage they have caused to our country. Something similar happened to Germany after the end of Second World War. However, Germany went through a denazification program. You know, my grandmother died in Auschwitz. So I have my personal account with Second World War. However, Germany went through the denazification program after losing the war. Given that Russia is a nuclear weapon state, it is very difficult to expect something like this. Nobody is going to come to Moscow and to do some program for Russian state. It's just impossible. It's another situation, and this makes meaningful conversation about reconciliation with Russians very, very difficult. Taking into consideration all this nature of this conflict and that Russia is a country with nuclear weapon.
Can I jump in, Chris?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Yeah, what I hear, like this other word, like to throw into the mix from both from Roman and from Rachel, is this idea of accountability, like any sense of reparations or forgiveness that doesn't demand or ask for accountability, like is not a long-term solution. Like it's not a path for healing. Like it might work in the short term, but there's no lasting, justice without. Well, just like Roman said, like you're not going to go to Moscow without them being held to account for the actions that they've done. And so and all these things, just like Rachel said, were mentioned about the students in her class saying, like, don't ask me to forgive somebody who's done this to me. Like, I mean, there's a way to process these things internally from a caregiving perspective, but also there is a deep sense within justice of accountability, like to be able to move through these things as humans. Like we have to be able to own that stuff as well. So I just wanted to throw that word into the mix as well.
Oh, no problem.
And to add to what Josh was just saying, it reminds me of Bonhoeffer's definition of costly grace, which clearly states is a call for justice, condemns the sin before you can even think about asking for forgiveness. And that before you can even think about reconciliation, reparation in some way, shape, or form. So you do not, what would we call it? Dehumanize the actual suffering that is occurring, and that is your reality. That is the reality right now. So at the same time, how can we enter appropriately, like you said, Josh, and stand in solidarity?
Absolutely.
I mean, in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started with that. It really was a mass national confessional in a way. And it was different from what was done in Germany, because it was felt that, and again, because of that sense of Ubuntu, that what is needed is the healing of the nation rather than justice in the sense of crime and punishment. Now, I think where they fell short is they didn't really pay enough attention to the economic aspects and the need for reparations. But on the whole, in terms of the framework of confessing and also helping people process their grief by literally telling them where the bodies are buried, all of that was part of the process. So it's not a matter of quick and easy, let's let go of the past, but it is done in the process of saying, for the sake of tomorrow. We do need to find a way of dealing with the past and working through this grief and confessing the sins and the injustices.
Absolutely. You know,
So, Rachel, if I may ask, just looking back at this commission in your country, in South Africa, do you think it really worked out? How would you evaluate it today?
Since I don't live in South Africa, it's difficult for me to really assess that. I think it's had mixed reviews. I think it helped us make that transition. It was part, and it's not necessarily the commission itself, but the whole ethos that was built into it helped the country avoid going into full-blown civil war. I mean, I am not a military expert. I can't predict how close we actually would have gotten to that. But at least there was this sense of that, this willingness to hold Indaba, right, to get together and have a conversation and move the country forward was a very positive development. In terms of the aftermath, there are many who consider that to have been too nice and too kind and without sufficient accountability. And again, when it comes to an aspect that was brought up initially as part of the TRC was that of reparations. And, you know, because one of the great aftermaths, not great, one of the large aftermaths of apartheid is, of course, the economic disparities that still, I mean, South Africa is still one of the most unequal societies in the world. And that is, I think, in the long run, a very risky situation for the country and destabilizes it significantly.
Yeah. I'm asking this question because in Poland we had this process of reconciliation between Poland and Germany. And I have to say that it really worked fine. I'm really amazed to see how this really long process, how it changed people's minds. And I think I shared with some of you this how it really happened, but I may repeat shortly. So it was in 65. There was this Cardinal Kominek in my town, actually, in Wrocław, Breslau. And together with other Polish bishops, they wrote this letter to German bishops, Catholics to Lutheran bishops. And the basic theme was we forgive and we ask for forgiveness. And this was under communism, and this cardinal and those bishops, they were hated by communist government. And as I understand, those bishops, Lutheran bishops who received it in Germany, they also were not accepted easily. I mean, their attitude. However, this whole letter was taken by Willy Brandt, who was the chancellor at that point. And he would come to Poland and spend lots of time really visiting places like Auschwitz, Birkenau, and others. And Warsaw Uprising place, and he would kneel down. He would ask for forgiveness. He would, just symbolic acts of some kind of being sorry for that. And this was the beginning of this of this whole process, which was 65 and then 70. So I remember when I was a kid, naturally as kids, we hated Russians and we hated Germans, and so this was how it worked. It was still the end of the 20th century. But today, when I'm playing soccer with my son, and he asks me who I am, so I say, well, I'm Brazil, and then I ask him, okay, who you are, and he says, I'm German. So then my always first reaction is, you must be crazy. Nobody wants to be German. But then I realized, well, this whole process of reconciliation worked out in this way, that this reconciliation really somehow changed the mindset of these kids, really. Everybody. So when we ask today what we think of Germany on Polish streets, most of the answer would be, we really like them. We really accept them. And it's, well, we would like to be, many Poles would like to be like Germans. There is no problem in visiting Germany and being friends with Germans or something like that. So I think on the one hand, I'm thinking, well, this process of reconciliation is a very difficult, sometimes almost impossible task. But then I'm thinking, well, it is working out. I have seen it. I have seen the miracle, and this is something that is really amazing. But then I'm also thinking of Hannah Arendt, and I think Derrida also, they dealt with this issue of reconciliation, especially from the perspective of nations and this big social groups. And they asked this question: is forgiveness the condition sine qua non for reconciliation? And I think, just surprisingly, both of them would say no. You can reconcile without or you can reconcile with some kind of symbolic forgiveness, but not really with a kind of very, let's say, real or literal forgiveness between both sides. They say that sometimes it is simply impossible, and sometimes just forcing forgiveness, it might be a tool used by oppressive power systems. Like, let's say again, like a church, like the Pope, who is asking for forgiveness, Canadian, native Indians who were, killed or misused in the 19th century. Well, there are no people though there are no victims alive who can forgive, and then this forgiveness may only take place in some kind of symbolic sense, and it can be easily used by politicians or political structures, I think.
What you said there about forgiveness or rather reconciliation without forgiveness, I think that captures an element of what I was trying to say, and I'm going to remember the way you put it because it's helpful for me. When I say that we are caught between the whence and the whither, right? The where we're from and where we're going. The where we're from is often so full of pain that it's impossible to really let go of it, that forgiveness isn't necessarily possible. But for the sake of where we want to go, even if it's not for my generation, if it's for my children and children's children's generation, you start to do the things, the kind of a pragmatic, it's kind of like the way that faith sometimes works. You don't actually necessarily believe everything, but you start practicing it for the sake of kind of that spiritual discipline that leads you in that direction.
Chris, am I allowed to comment on Sally's comment in the chat?
Oh yes, please. Let's read
Sally
the comment
is saying
first.
maybe the impact of such reconciliation work is greater on future generations. Sad for the ones who experienced such trauma.
Right.
And so I can see that. As a German, I would say that reconciliation should never come at the expense of forgetting history. And so several days ago, there was a commemoration of Kristallnacht, 85 years of Kristallnacht. The Brandenburg Gate was lit up, and it said, "Never again is now. Nie wieder ist jetzt." And I think that's important. I think that goes back to what Roman said. Right now, Ukraine is hurting, suffering on so many levels. We can't let that disappear in the news. It has to be addressed. We have to stand in solidarity. If resilience is going to be built, it's only going to be built, as Rachel said, if we come together. But we have to stand and we have to speak in respectful ways that empower, if this is at all possible during suffering. Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, who was my ethics teacher and who was best friends with Elizabeth Schüssler-Fiorenza, had this to say. She would say, if you see a wound, you must recognize it. Do not enter into the space of the one who's hurting unless you're willing to be part of the healing process, and however that is needed for the long term. And I think that's what I hear us saying a little bit, and maybe that helps expand Sally's position a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you for addressing that. And Dr. Tripodi, I just want to stay with you for a bit. When we think about...
Okay, can you?
Oh, yeah, I'm with you. I want to stay with you for a bit. When we think about what it looks like to be resilient, particularly in a time when you're in the midst of the suffering. So not necessarily when we're thinking about suffering as, a mystery or a memory rather, or a place where we've come from, but a very present reality. Share a bit about how spirituality and how mindfulness can become a true way of healing rather than just an escape of suffering, not just something that kind of just takes the edge off of it, but something that actually helps with the healing process.
Yeah. I think this may tie into what you were saying about moral injury, war injury as well. So there are different types, of course, of resilience. Right now, as Dr. Solovey shared with us, there is a survival resilience at work for Ukrainians, whether they're fighting, whether they're family, whether they're divided. So that whole fight, flight, freeze, how are we going to survive? The United Nations Health Organization has just released a report a couple months ago that said that civilians in Ukraine show very high levels of resiliency simply because they're struggling for survival. Mm-hmm. Where are we going to get food? Where are we going to stay? How are we going to survive? How are our children going to survive? That's one type of resiliency because it really addresses that immediate need. Once a conflict is resolved, you're moving into a different type of resiliency, which goes back to what Josh talked about in terms of moral injury, soldiers, their families coming back. You're supposed to move forward into a normalized society. And the question is, what on God's earth can that look like? Right. Which brings God, the whole aspect of spirituality into the conversation, where we have to be very, very careful. As a practical theologian, I would say, and go back to what Dr. Solovey said in the beginning, there is no one answer. Because for what may be meaningful to somebody because they can find hope in God and hope in faith may be a question and a loss of faith for someone else. And so then how does the church, how do we partner with professionals who can help bring together the spiritual as well as the psychological care and aspect? Which reminds me of some of the stories that you've told us when you were here, Dr. Cherva, when you were here at Union, about how you all as a seminary addressed those kind of needs, because spirituality in itself can become a healing tool. Tool is such a horrible word. Take that out of the video, okay? Instrument. The connection to the divine can be helpful, but it can also, if it's not appropriately processed through trauma care, it can become an obstacle. Mm-hmm. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Anyone else would like to share a bit on their perspective, thinking about the ways in which spirituality and mindfulness can become a way of healing rather than escape?
And I assumed, Chris, that you wanted a definition of resiliency that goes beyond initial, how do I deal with trauma responses, that fight, flight, freeze, which are very, very important. Please don't get me wrong here, but long-term healing, and how can the church in a meaningful way engage?
Yeah. And you know, to even respond to that, I think about something you just said that made me think about just the ways in which people, when they're pushed to extreme margins, and the ways in which they are looking for ways to escape and ways to cope. So it makes me think about, even as a former school teacher, when I would see students who had very difficult situations at home or in their communities, the ways in which they would just try to cope. And if you're not really paying attention to the details of it, you're thinking, oh, this kid doesn't care about their future. They just don't want to do school, or they're ruining their future. But if you're really paying attention to the details, it's the trauma that's hindering their ability to fully function. It's the trauma that's pulling them towards means to cope, to just really numb the pain that's such a consistent thing throughout their lives. So something you said in that really brought me to that point that I thought was relevant. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, and what you just said, Josh, correct, you have more information on this than I do, and more experience, not just information, but that whole knowing, being, doing, in terms of military, family, and moral injury, and what impact it has on families.
Yeah, it does. And I'm really mindful. I mean, once again, like even how I started, like me talking about coming home, and then with Roman earlier, it said something that really struck me, that, I mean, there's the vicarious levels of trauma. The second, like, everybody's is inundated with it, and a lot of the issues, at least in the U.S. context, of talking about war and trauma, is how uninformed and how it doesn't impact. Like people think it doesn't impact them, and so to get
Right.
churches to be able to talk about this, to be able to share these stories of like, oh, moral injury is just a them problem. Like this doesn't impact our community, but it's a way to be able to talk about trauma and talk about these stories in a way to say that it does implicate us. It doesn't, like we all are invested in this. Like there is no like moving towards change until we're all more fully aware of what's going on. And so then like the military family of just like what it means having a loved one who has multiple deployments, who comes and goes, and like trying to live a normal life, to go to church, to do those things in your community when everything is upended within your own home. And so to be able to enhance and like have some stronger resilience with that, with spiritual practices and things like that, I think are all beautiful ideas that you all have said. So I echo what you said.
I appreciate that.
In the United States, war tends to be a thing of over there, right? So there's a sort of a
Right,
distancing,
yes.
physically and psychologically.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, not only military families and, of course, veterans themselves, but think about society. Think how many of the homeless on the streets are veterans.
Yes.
As the result of unhealed trauma. And so I think here is almost the opposite problem than one would normally face, which is that it's the problems are there, the trauma is there, but it's being ignored. It doesn't become part of the national conversation always. I want to say something else about, talking about that there are different ways in which people survive trauma. I had the privilege some years ago to meet Immaculée Ilibagiza, who wrote a book called Left to Tell of her survival of the Rwanda genocide. She's a very devout Catholic, and she was a guest at Villanova University where I used to work. And many people, after her talk, criticized her for being too forgiving, that she had found too much the ability to forgive the perpetrators. But then she said, but for her, that's the thing that enables her to move on. So on the one hand, we want to say we should be able to create reconciliation without forgiveness, but we should also allow people to forgive when that is what they are capable of and what they feel necessary. For her, it was a step into building. For her, that was future orientation of this happened. And she really, the things that she told, she lost most of her family. She hid in a bathroom with several other people for 3 months. Literally, they couldn't lie down. With really harrowing experiences. And nevertheless, that for her, religion was a coping mechanism. Now, sometimes religion can be an unhealthy coping mechanism, but for her, it was the thing that enabled her to move forward. For others, it would be other things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Solovey, I want to ask you this final question of our time as we think about, at the time of this recording, we know that the Ukrainian conflict is ongoing, and against all expectations, the Ukrainian army is fighting, and yet the cost is so high for everyone involved in this conflict. Think about the loss of life, destruction of land, suffering of families that are being torn apart. With all that in mind, I want to ask you, what does the coping of refugees look like long term? And also, how has your initial support of refugees changed? And what sort of long-term impact do you envision?
Yes, it's a huge drama for Ukraine that we lost so big part of our population. We have a couple of millions of people on occupied territories and couple of millions who moved to Russia from occupied territories. We have at least 6-8 millions. There are different estimations of the people who are refugees, like in Poland, in Germany, and throughout Europe, in United States, in United Kingdom, up to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and many other countries. And we have near 5-6 millions of the people who are internally displaced persons. So the whole structure of social life, of economy, of relationships is damaged, severely damaged.
Mm-hmm.
So in the beginning, the most important issue was just physical survival. When the war started, millions of the people were on the road. Lviv railway station, the city where I live, was the most crowded place in the world. Every day 40,000 people were arriving to Lviv railway station, because Lviv is on the border with Poland. It's the biggest city in the west of Ukraine, and actually all of those people were going through Lviv to Poland and then to other countries. So at that time, food, hygiene products, tea, other things, clothes, place to spend the night were very important. And evangelical churches in Western and Central Ukraine, they became, as I would say, a rescue network. So every church was converted into sort of hotel, hostel, cafeteria, medical point. I've been to one of the churches in Chernivtsi, it's southern of Ukraine, where through Chernivtsi people go to Romania, and the whole church was basically a refugee place for 200 people, with lawyer, with doctors, with pastors, providing all kinds of help for people to survive. Now, there are other problems. The people need to learn how to live new life, because we've all been thinking it's just temporary, few more weeks, 2-3 weeks, few more months, and it will go back to normal. We will liberate our territories. We will go back to our villages. We will go back to our lives. Now we have this bitter time of understanding there is no return to previous life. There will be some life after the war, one day, hopefully, but this will be totally different life. Everything will be different. So now it's very important to help those people to learn to live in new normality, both abroad and inside the country. That requires a lot of economical measures. People need to have some jobs. Like many of them are educated people. That was by the way, it was one of the shocks when old Ukrainian diaspora in America met this new Ukrainian immigrants, because they thought they would come, like almost naked, without any skills, language. And many of those people, they are well educated. They had some business backgrounds. They had good careers. And for them, it's really difficult to learn how to continue doing this in totally different countries. So this is a whole set of challenges. Now, family disunions, how to return families. A man can't leave Ukraine according to marital law. They have to stay inside of the country. We have the whole generation of children being raised without one of their parents. And now there are the whole programs how we can help family to keep some unity and contacts, being splitted, being away from each other. And the same problems inside of the country. Also relationships with those who are on occupied territories. Like we have people who come to get food parcels to our church, and I talk to all of them. That's part of my my work, as I say, just to feel what they are feeling, to go some part of their journey with them, and they have terrible feelings about their relatives who decided to stay under occupation because they could have some pro-Russian sentiments, or because they were afraid to leave, especially older people. They sometimes live in cities like Bakhmut or Mariupol that are totally destroyed, and those people say, we don't know how to go, where to go, we prefer to stay. So all those divisions need to be healed somehow. We need programs of social rehabilitation, economical measures to help those people to continue living, because there is no way back to the pre-war situation. And it's very difficult to accept this new reality. We fight internally. In my heart, in my mind, I can't reconcile that there is no more life as I had before the war. And that was actually my mantra when the war started. As historian and philosopher, I understood there is no way back. And I was talking about that to my family, to my children. That's it, our previous normal life is over. We will not be back to that anymore. And they were not ready to accept that for a long, long time. So a lot of challenges, a lot of wounds and injuries, social, psychological, economical, personal, collective, and it would take generations and hard work, at least somehow to put all of that together. And just my last comment, as war continues, those internal divisions inside of the country, they are growing. As I mentioned, tensions between those who serve in the army and those who stay in a peaceful life. Tensions between families who have lost family members in the war and those who survived. Tensions between those who stayed in the country and those who moved outside of the country. Tensions between those who live in liberated territories and occupied territories. So a lot of difficult work before us, and a great need of your help and support.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, and just everything you shared with us today. I think it's just really critical for folks who only get a chance to hear about this from the news or get a chance to read about this in the paper. Now being able to engage in this webinar and get like a primary source, this is helping to paint the picture for people. So thank you so much, Dr. Solovey and Dr. Scarba, Dr. Bard, Dr. Tripodi, and Dr. Morris, all of you so much for all the insight, the wisdom you shared, and it really has been just a fruitful conversation. I want to let everyone know that this recording, or this webinar rather, has been recorded and will be available for distribution later. We're going to be able to share it through the Leadership Institute podcast and also through the Union Presbyterian Seminary's YouTube page. So please be on the lookout for that. And also, lastly, if you want more information about the Leadership Institute, please feel free to subscribe to leadershipinstitute.substack.com. Once you're subscribed, you'll be able to know about all of the offerings, including webinars just like the one you've watched. So please be on the lookout for that. I want to once again thank all of my panelists so much for their time, and thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, God bless you, and please do take care.